Thank you, Snow, for sponsoring this episode of the Coffee Podcast. I drink a few cups of coffee in the morning and another at night on special occasions. I've learned coffee is great for my health, so I'm left with the challenge we all face as coffee enthusiasts who love to smile. That's where Snow comes in. Their solution is backed by $1.4 million of research and development, caters to those of us with sensitive teeth, and shows results just after 3 days. Get 15% off your first order at trysnow.com for a limited time with the code COFFEEPOD. You're listening to the Coffee Podcast. This is the Coffee Science Series, Collecting and Understanding Data. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the scientific method this way, quote, principles and procedures for the systematic pursuit of knowledge involving the recognition and formulation of a problem, the collection of data through observation and experiment, and the formulation and testing of hypotheses, end quote. Did you hear that? The collection of data. This is the topic today, and I promise to not bore you. Instead, I hope to inspire you with a special guest as we unravel the wonders of data analysis. Rebecca Pandolf is the chief of the statistics section at the International Coffee Organization. Rebecca has done extensive work in data analysis across a variety of sectors during her career. She did work around anti-dumping policy, which according to Wikipedia, because I had to look this up, is when, quote, manufacturers export a product to another country at a price below the normal price with an injuring effect, end quote. Feel free to go down that fascinating rabbit hole yourself because we don't have time for it here, and this is, after all, the Coffee Podcast. All that to say, I get the impression the World Trade Organization anti-dumping agreement and policies concerning it would be a really difficult to manage situation considering technical nuances. This is where data analysis really tends to shine and why sectors like the coffee sector need and should be thankful for great minds like Rebecca's working to see complex trends in the data. Rebecca most recently was involved with the International Cotton Advisory Committee, which is part of what is called the International Commodity Bodies. This is a group of bodies, like the International Coffee Organization, that intermediate between consumers and producers of commodities like coffee. The ICO is where you can find Rebecca hard at work today.
So one of the main tasks that I've been doing is we have a legacy database. It was finalized in 2007. So right now we are updating that. It's SQL, and the main goal for this, besides cleaning up some of the stuff, is to put all of our data in an online interface. So rather than having to use outdated Excel sheets, because we do have some data on our website, but we only update them maybe once a year, quarterly. People can just go to the site then and download the data directly.
Okay.
So that's kind of a big task. I oversee a team of 2 people that do a lot of the data gathering and processing. We get data from a bunch of different sources, including reports from members, national statistics offices, private sector people, and they do the processing so that it can go into our database. And also one of the other big interesting projects besides analyzing the data is working with the public-private sector for coffee and cotton to help come up with indicators that can be used in both of these commodities to measure sustainability.
You mentioned identifying indicators. What does that mean?
You basically want something so that when you say like, oh, I want to know if this farm is productive, like if it has good yields, you want to make sure everyone's on the same page about like what are you actually measuring, and then and you keep doing this over time. So it's it's almost like setting up a standard, but it's a measurement. You might look at yield. So you define what exactly does yield mean. And then if you track it over time, it kind of indicates this is the productivity over time.
I was going to say the accuracy of words when you're looking at analysis and you're doing statistics is critical, right? For coming to conclusions.
Yes, very critical.
So I think this is a great segue into a very, very vague question, which is, what is data? And I guess the context for us is, what is data in the context of coffee?
There is a bit of a distinction between what I'd say is data and then information. So data is kind of like this pool of unorganized pieces of information. And then when you process it or analyze it, that's where you get actual information you can use to make decisions. You might have some information, like qualitative information about like the quality of coffee. You might also have some prices, but they don't mean anything until you organize it into actual information.
Okay, so it's kind of like, I don't know if we're going to draw an analogy straight out of coffee. Like if you have a coffee plant and you have the coffee cherry, you just have the cherry. It's like this raw thing. Yeah. And until we turn that into a roasted seed, then we really don't have value until you can drink it or you can grind or what have you. So there's all this process required to get it to a point of information, which could be seen as maybe like the final cup.
That's a really good analogy.
I'm trying to be super dramatic with this.
I mean, because that's really, it is. We get a lot of raw material. You get like a series of numbers, and then you have to process it into something usable for other people, particularly people not familiar with raw data. And that's really what a lot of my work is.
Yeah, normally my analogies fall flat on their face, so I think that one might have worked.
Yes, yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, what are relevant data points and in your work environment, so maybe in the ICO, like what are things that are important to you, like these raw things to collect? Like how do you determine like what you do record or collect and what you don't?
So with it's not just for where I'm working right now, but also with cotton, a lot of these bodies, they have mandates about what type of data they're supposed to collect. And for International Coffee Organization, a lot of this stems from the quota periods because they needed to track what was traded in order to allocate the quotas each year. We've moved more towards advocating for market transparency. So that also means looking at market information, which is supply and demand parameters. You're looking at production, trade, ideally area and yield, as well as consumption and exports and stocks. Prices are also very important when you're looking at the market. And then because we're working with governments and trade policies, we also are building a collection of tariff rates and information on non-tariff barriers as well, because it's good to see about market access.
How do we know we can trust the data? So there's this stuff that's collected. I'm trying to stick with the analogy of like, how do we know this coffee is going to be worth drinking? It's not going to have defects. Like, what does that process look like? Or how do we know we can trust a data set or a pool of data?
So I'd say, I mean, it's also similar. So when you think about it, like someone tasting coffee when it's fresh off and even just picking it, there's certain actual measurable things that you can look at, but there's also a bit of like it comes with experience as well. So in the terms of things that even if you're new, what you can look at is knowing just like how what the methodologies were for gathering the initial data, looking at like how robust, because almost every single, like when they're looking at production and stuff, almost no one goes out and collects and counts every single coffee tree out there. So you have to look and see like how do they adjust for estimations. With trade, usually what we do and a lot of other international statistics bodies will look at is what they call mirror statistics. So it's kind of like if, say, the US, they report that they imported 300,000 bags from Mexico in a given period, you go and look and see how much if Mexico is reporting. You're not going to get perfect alignment due to timing issues, but if they're within a certain tolerance, then you can say that it makes the data more valid. And then when you look at multiple partners, if all of the US imports match up with their partners, and you can say that their data is pretty reliable.
So as an example, you said Mexico, they have reported some kind of number of exports, and You're comparing that to what the U.S. is declaring as
Yeah.
imports of the same thing to see if it's validate. Okay,
Yeah.
to see if they validate one another. Okay, so that's like a way of saying, oh, this number is reliable.
Yeah.
Okay, cross-checking. Yeah, got you. Have you had any experiences with data in coffee where you saw the number or the conclusion? I guess that's more the analysis.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to stick to the data. Have you ever seen data that you were like, oh no, that's not going to be
All the
trustworthy?
time.
Or oh gosh.
Because you do, so going back to, I've seen it both in our own data that we've collected. So that's one of the other projects is kind of what I'm saying is cleaning up the time series. So this is where it
Yeah.
gets a little bit more subjective, but there should be, we use, it's an approach, USDA has a really good paper on it, but it's called the balance sheet concept that the data ties together. So when looking
Okay.
at supply and demand for an individual country, it should be internally consistent over time. And it works like you have opening stocks, production, and imports count as the total available supply within a given year. And during that year, at the same time that they're
Okay.
bringing in this, then they're also consuming and exporting the coffee. Whatever is left over goes into ending stocks. So these should, it's an equation. And if that equation doesn't actually work out, there means there's some kind of internal inconsistency in the data over time. And we've had that issue.
Okay.
Similarly, if you look at some of the like if you graph it, you can actually visually see there's issues. Like you'd expect, like production, especially for Brazil, for instance, there is a certain kind of biannual pattern, and you can see it like where it goes up and down. For especially with Arabica production, it could look weird. Like I've also seen with some countries, the consumption kind of moves up in steps, which if you think about how consumption grows in real life,
Mhm.
you're not going to see that type of pattern. So that's a little bit more subjective.
Yeah, it's more of a
Yeah,
smooth.
yeah,
So like the shapes of the data that they take when you see them, say on a time series graph
yeah.
or something, is going to indicate to you something's off here. Or yeah, I guess for me, I'm really digging into the data analysis life and the distinction between something that has happened that is unique
Mhm.
versus something that is like an error in the data. Like that requires experience. I feel like you can't just like look at a data set and be like, oh, for sure that's wrong data. Because sometimes crazy
Yeah.
things happen and it needs to be blown up and looked deeper into, right? So it's not so easy as just being like,
Yeah.
oh, that just
So I'd
doesn't look
say,
right.
so you'd probably use that
Or,
as a starting point. And you, even with particular countries, because we're looking at a lot of
mhm,
countries, you're not going to know everything about every country unless you've been, I mean, I've been working in coffee for
right,
3 years. So I'll use that as a starting point, and I'll go back and look and see, like, why did production drop off here? Was there an actual reason, or is it more likely to be error? So that's
mm-hmm,
also where you look in the balance sheet concept. It's
yeah,
like, so was their trade down? Is the trade source reliable? Did they have, I don't know, like really severe drought, and or was in some cases it's actually there's civil war going on.
yeah,
But then if you can't find any
yeah,
explanation,
it's
then you
wild.
start to then you really need to look and see. Sometimes you can even track down what caused the error, but usually,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so it's a mix of doing the research and then seeing if you can find out what's causing the error.
So you have to be really curious to do this kind of
Yeah,
job,
yeah,
right? You can't just like come across like a funky dip in the time series and be like, oh, whatever. You got to be the person who's like, what's happening there, and sort of like a private eye and go into the details. And yeah, that's really cool. I want our listeners to understand like the word data. It kind of has the same vibe to me off the bat as something like talking about health, where it's like the word itself can sound
Mm,
boring. Like we're doing some content on coffee health. But like once you actually dig into it and you start to look at the nuances of what's happening and what it involves, you're like, oh my gosh, this is actually really fascinating and interesting and valuable. I guess my follow-up question to what makes data trustworthy and all that jazz is, where does statistics fit into this conversation? Because it's my impression you can't just do analysis without considering significance and confidence level. I mean, I'm getting out of my realm
mm.
here, but where does statistics fit?
I mean, you almost have to step back. Statistics in certain circles tends to be focused really on the statistical modeling, but it's larger than that. For instance, the UN Statistics Division, they do a lot with data collection, processing, and disseminating data. They also work on helping to standardize definitions for data, as well as improving data collection for the members, rather than just the modeling part of that. I mean, because you can't do if you don't have good data to start with, you can't really do any of the modeling.
Yeah, it's not reliable. It goes back
Yeah,
to
exactly.
that. Yeah.
I mean, you're going to get, you can get results with it, but they're not good results. So that's why, for me, like one of my personal passions
Okay.
has really been getting into methodologies and metadata, like really understanding what your data is. Because without knowing that, you can't come up with good
Okay, yeah.
analysis. So this is kind of like if you're looking at prices over time, you need to know like how are these prices gathered, and if you want to compare across countries, are you really, because we have a series called Price to Growers, but not all the countries use the same starting point. So if you're just going to be using that,
Right. Right.
if you're, and we try to let people know that are using in this, if you're going to compare across countries, you have to be really careful, because you can start at what's actually paid to the farmer, but once you move away from that, you need to start adjusting for different costs added in, like the transport costs at different points. If they have any types of
Yeah.
taxes, like domestic taxes, that also occur.
Right. And sometimes too, in similar data like that, there's the difference between, the parchment coffee or, is it soluble or is it, right? Coffee isn't coffee is coffee, or however you say that. It's like there's all this important context that I guess that's considered metadata, right? Where you have kind of like the core number, and then you have this like, oh, and by the way, it's soluble.
Yeah, exactly. It's the data about the
which
data.
is pretty important. The data in the data. It's a data-ception, as they say, I guess.
Yeah.
They don't say that. So why should we care? So I'm a coffee producer. Why should I care about data collection, statistical analysis, standardizing terms for data? Why should I care at all? What's the value to me?
The reason why data analysis, data science has taken off is it helps empower people to come to better decisions. For instance, maybe you have a gut feeling, you're like, I don't know which coffee should I buy next time, like which one sold better. I mean, most people probably actually have the data on hand and don't realize it, but you can go and see, like, you can measure which coffee actually sold the most that year. So if it's from one particular origin, then like, oh, this one's really popular in this past year. Let's buy more of this one and less of the one that didn't sell better. And they can even, because they have, if you're a roaster, you have a lot of the data on hand. If you're missing data, though, somewhere like the International Coffee Organization gives you a much broader perspective. So maybe you want to buy more, but you're kind of wondering, like, oh, what's, like, how available is this coffee? Are they a large producer or not? What does the prospects look like for next year? Because maybe a lot of people consider, like, they're going to reduce the production due to maybe the weather is not looking so good when it was flowering or whatever, which means you might have to pay more compared to the previous year. It also helps you, like, when you're talking to people,
I guess,
having the same starting point for discussions. So you're all talking about the same thing. Like, this is what we're measuring and talking about.
I'm trying to think as well for producers, having access to, and we're going to talk about this, I think, more soon, but having access to data, like consumer data, would be critical, right? Like, what are consumer preferences? Where are they leaning towards? And, how can I adapt the way I'm processing my coffee or what have you to make it more marketable to the larger portion of the coffee consuming market? Or, having access. I think the thing about data that maybe we don't realize off the bat when we're learning about it is that it can be used in a lot of different ways. You can use the same data and have a totally different business goal and be using the same exact data and come to different conclusions that are just, they both happen to be there in the data. So maybe one coffee company is like, I just want to sell whatever is going to sell the fastest. But maybe another coffee company is like, I want to sell coffee that is unique and not as popular. And so you could use the same data set and, grab out your own value from it. which is, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconceptions, I feel like, around data because it's such a boring word.
That's
But
why, well, transparency in general and democratization of data is becoming more and more important is because, as I said before, like you don't really necessarily have information with data. That's really done with on the analysis side. So when you put data out there, same with World Bank has a lot of data, UN as well, is that allows people, and nowadays it's a lot easier to do analysis, cheaper than it used to be. I know people have done stuff on their phones, even with analysis. Being able to take the data, look
yeah.
at it, bring your own experience, and come up with different conclusions or new information that might be helpful to other people.
How would you describe market transparency? Obviously, it's going to bring in more minds, but couldn't it also, I'm going to play like the opposite end, couldn't it also bring in people who don't know how to interpret the data or use it and thus bad information? I guess it would be the flip side.
So the more that's out there, the more that other people can come in and kind of pick at it, which is why like a lot of disciplines, they publish stuff in journals. So someone can put something out there. And then because
Right.
it's out there and not just kept, because a company can do that as well. I mean, that's why they want to hire really good people. You could have certain assumptions in place and come into, especially with bias and whatnot, come to a bad conclusion because no one else is really looking at it or asking the right questions for you. So putting it out there, it
Yeah.
allows other people to kind of come in. And we do get that sometimes. We'll have people come in and ask us questions like, how did you come to this conclusion? Or why do you think consumption is going to be like this type of thing? Or are you sure this is correct? And sometimes that will actually have us go back and revise things. Other times it just helps us broaden our understanding. So it's also, in a certain sense, the transparency is an accountability tool.
Built-in accountability because you have a lot more eyes on it. So I can imagine the pressure also being like 10 times higher because it's not just like a room of data scientists or whatever looking at it. It's like the whole world has access to the raw data.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's these companies, they've been collecting coffee data for a while. They've been doing the science and all this other stuff, but it's all behind closed doors, right? It's not accessible to the public. In your opinion, do you feel like private data is a bad thing?
No, I mean, because the problem with a lot of data is there's a high cost to collecting data, which is why it's not easy to give out for free. And for companies, it can be a lot of ways the way they make their profit, make their money. So in that sense, no, but I think it's good to have a mixture of both public and private data. And a lot of times with public, especially for academia, for instance, they don't need the most recent data. So you can still have your private data, especially the most recent data. But ideally what would happen is the companies, you might have it shared through providing data through like a public institution. There's a bit of a time lag, and also that you can anonymize. So if you're maybe collecting retail prices from actual roasters, for instance, is anonymizing it and putting a bit of a lag there so that you still can enable people to analyze longer term trends without threatening their positions.
So there's definitely ways to democratize the data by anonymizing it, right? By saying, yeah, these are unique values, but you don't know who it means, right? But I still think that, that'd be nerve-wracking. Like if I was a business owner in coffee and my data was in that database, like to sign off and say, yeah, it's cool if you anonymize me and release it. I'm like putting a lot of trust into, the data scientists or whoever, that you can't like somehow reverse engineer it and figure out who that company is or whatever.
Yeah, so it's difficult.
So there's a lot of trust involved here.
I mean, that's why you don't see it happen that often. You can also do things to kind of build trust as well. You could probably maybe go with something less risky, and then over time, if you're shown to be a reliable source or institution for gatekeeping and handling the data, you're more likely to get the trickier pieces.
So there are words in coffee. This is a problem. We know this is a problem. On the Coffee Podcast, we've talked about this. Words are important. We can even get into the realm of saying, like, can we stop calling it a coffee bean? Some of us are that intense about using the right words. There's this element across this series, but we've been talking about this on the podcast for a while. Data reveals things. It allows us to define terms with more accuracy. We talked about that, you and I, just during this conversation earlier on. And one of the terms that I hear tossed around all the time is blah 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 smallholder producer, right? There's this it's like this some kind of data statement, and then they throw in the word smallholder producer, and every single time I think to myself, like, what is that? What is a smallholder producer? And like, where's the line between the smallholder producer and like the not smallholder producer?
So I may kind of back up a little bit in the sense that
Yeah.
in some ways too, that's kind of the work of the standardization, is coming up with these shared meanings. On one hand, you can use the data to create the definitions, but on the other hand, you can also just come up with the definition and then share it. And that's where the metadata comes in. And we also, which we'll be updating over the next year as well, as we have data definitions, so that when we say price to growers, what do we actually mean?
Yeah.
When we say world, even something as simple as production, when we're talking about production, what does our production figure actually capture? Because with production, you can have how much was actually grown on a particular tree, or say how much was harvested off of the tree, or even how much was sold.
Yeah.
It's a mixture
and those are so different.
It's a mixture of kind of saying like, so it's really, that's where you really need to know like what the data is. I mean, ideally, every time when they're writing things down, people will actually put the definition that they're using, because smallholder producer, it across countries means different things. Like in Brazil, because they have a lot of much larger producers on average, their idea of small is going to be very different than a country that's mostly smallholders, where like 1 hectare is quite large.
So standardizing that seems critical to me. It's kind of, I mean, a really non-serious version of this from the cafe side is something like in the US, there's this thing called the cortado. Well, actually, I don't even have to use the cortado. The cortado is a drink that definitely is like everybody's doing something a little different with it. But for me as well, flat white, that's one in the US that's like totally just like nobody has a clue what they're doing. So a customer goes like to one cafe and like, I'll have a flat white. And the barista is like, what are they ordering? Yeah. It's terrible. But that's like a really sort of innocent version. Maybe it's innocent version of like a more serious thing to get wrong, which I think is getting smallholder producer wrong is really dangerous, because the claims that are made around that term and that topic are typically pretty strong claims, and so understanding the context is critical. But
so you're gonna have, I mean,
I was just blabbering. So I don't know.
You're right though with the smallholder versus. I mean, cortado just means it could be very critical for a particular business, because customers go in expecting one thing and then they get something different because you're using different definitions. Not defining things properly basically leads to miscommunication, which is the seriousness of this is going to depend on what gets done with it. But smallholder, because it impacts a lot of policy, I think it has a much broader, or even maybe where funding goes, for instance. When they collect data, if they're collecting it at the farm level, they usually also collect farm size. So ideally what will happen is you will have a series of data points in the size of the farm. And you can, at that point, arbitrarily come up with what you want to call a smallholder. But when you do that, you need just put the definition. You can footnote it in there and be like, by smallholder, we mean farmers with a average farm size of X many hectares or less. When they're looking at it, not everyone reads that information, but it's there.
Then you can like bucket producers who are in a range of X hectare to whatever hectare, and and that makes sense, because then later too, if the word becomes standardized, you could go back to that data and you could reformat it, which would be ideal.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you have the pieces of information, then you can always go back in and update what you're doing later on, as long as all of that's married up together.
Are there any other words you've run into in the industry, like in coffee in particular, that you feel like really just need to be standardized? Like we just need to get on the same page.
I mean, sustainability is probably like the very big topic.
Oh gosh.
Like, what does it mean to be sustainable?
Yeah.
What does sustainability encompass? It's something that's kind of a bit what the Delta Project's getting at.
Yeah.
And then also probably within that, probably the really biggest one is living income. It's kind of a newish topic, but really critical.
Yeah.
But it's also one of the ones that's, yeah, if you don't define it properly, it can get misused very easily. Like, what does living income actually mean? So it's a very
Right.
unglamorous type of work is talking about definitions. But it's also fun in the sense of like, you're just doing a lot of negotiations and with trade agreements as well. That's really what a lot of this is negotiating over the meaning of words. It doesn't suit everyone, but it has its place.
Oh, I never thought of it
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
It's part of my previous job experience.
I never.
Yeah, so you're looking at, because even with trade, when you talk about, you get very specific, like the harmonized system of the tariff names. When you say shoes, you don't really just mean shoes. So you get very weird. Even with coffee, if you go and look up the HS code for that, they have a very specific, it's like unprocessed coffee, whether they actually split it off between decaffeinated or not
Oh, yeah.
decaffeinated. That's under 090111. You want to start looking into that chapter.
Okay. So the metadata is like built into the.
Yeah,
I
so you're
guess.
using the
Is that
same
right?
meaning, and that's
Okay,
why
okay.
you can do stuff with mirror statistics is you actually go off of the tariff lines. So you know you're talking about the same type of product. If you didn't have that, then it's kind of like,
Oh, okay.
are we talking about the same thing? But it should match up because you're using the exact same tariff
Right.
line codes.
We've talked about market transparency. I know we want to talk about access to the data, which we've touched on really briefly. How do you think industry data is used or should benefit the producer?
Right now, it's not very symmetrical. A lot of data from the consumer point of view is collected from the producers because that's where a lot of the concerns over. It's like, are they paid fair prices? So if you're a farmer, you might employ people and pay them wages. They want to know, like, are those wages paid? Are they fair? Do they help support people? How much fertilizer, pesticides, et cetera, are they using? So that goes into, and then somewhere like Starbucks could advertise like, oh, we pay fair wages or we get all of our coffee from sustainable producers. But from the industry, ideally it would be a back and forth. Like the farmers are also getting input like, oh, your coffee, we were able to sell a lot of coffee because you use such and such processes. And you do see that. I feel like a lot of the smaller independent roasters do that because they work directly with the producers, so they give them a lot more feedback. Kind of like they'll know like, oh, this coffee from this particular farmer sold really well. But for a lot of producers, I don't know if it's so much the consumer data as much as comparative data with other producers in their region, because they're somewhat limited by like the type of coffee producer. So if they see like, oh, my neighbor farmer, he's making a lot more money, I want to go and see like, what is he doing? What are his methods? How much space does he allow between trees?
Yeah.
How much fertilizer is he using? How did he address? We just had a pest incident. How did he handle that, or she? So it's more this kind of comparative. Even that type of data doesn't necessarily get fed back into them. Just creating feedback loops. So whenever certification bodies or whatever, whenever they're collecting data, it would be really nice if they actually thought about like, when I'm collecting data from these producers, how am I feeding it back to them so that they can also use it to help their own lives?
Well, yeah, and you mentioned this before too. There's something weighty as well. Like when, I don't know, Google or whoever is like, are you cool using our services? We are going to collect your data. And I hit the okay button or the sure, why not, you know, and sign over my first child or whatever I'm doing when I hit that button. I wonder if that's happening with the producer. Like, hey, you know, we're going to gather all this information with you. Are you okay with that? And I'm not saying a producer would say, no, don't collect my info or, you know, put my photo on bags or whatever. But in the coffee sector, I've noticed it just seems, like you said, it's not symmetrical. A lot of the data is benefiting the consuming country more than it's benefiting the producer. I can't quantify that statement, but it's what I'm observing.
And not even like they're intending. I mean, I'm sure some of it's like they have good intentions, but
Sure.
because their overall goal is not to help their producers necessarily, that's more of a side benefit. So they kind of have to make an effort to center their data collection and what they're trying to do around helping the producer. So if you start from that point, you're going to get better results.
I've seen some companies who collect data in coffee. They build kind of like a code of ethics. Like, this is, just so you know, like, this is how we're going to do it, and this is how it's going to benefit everyone. Because it's like you said, that research, the data collection itself isn't easy. It's like you have to have skills to know what you're doing. And then it's not cheap either. So you have to like pay, somebody's got to pay for it. So, but still the idea of like, my data is an asset, right? The information about my behavior and my choices, you don't get to just like collect that without my permission, I think is the idea. But it's getting into like a realm of ethics for sure.
So the other thing I was thinking about was there's a bit of a power imbalance. So farmers may get something, but it may not be actually equal to the true value of what they're giving, the data that they're giving to. So maybe what they're getting, they might get some ag extension type of, maybe some limited advice. Like, for this particular year, we might give you some fertilizer to use, because we're actually doing a kind of trial study to see if we fertilize, if it helps us on our end. So they're like, sure, why not? Because otherwise it wouldn't get it anyways. But like but the actual benefit that the company providing the fertilizers is going to be much greater than the cost of that. So it's more, it goes back into kind of like a power imbalance, the asymmetry. Like, they don't really even know what the value of the data is. And you may not know anyways until long after it's been collected.
That's definitely a can of worms for another time. I think that it's worth thinking about, though. In closing, so, our listeners are all over the place. They're coffee enthusiasts. Some of them are coffee tinkerers, which are people who are at home and they got their sciencey mentality, and they're going to do some coffee science at home. And then, we have people all over the industry listening. My question would be, what would you recommend as a fun at-home experiment, like a data experiment, where our listeners say all they have is like basic brew equipment?
We do get a lot of data, like requests for information. Where I work, the International Coffee Organization, we have a lot of data. We provide a lot more data for free to students, and also in kind of quid pro quo type of, like, if you want to write something for us that we can publish type of thing. A lot of it's time series, is looking over at time, or comparative type of analysis is looking at probably even something as simple as like doing if you're just into brewing, is maybe just even looking at production trends over time. Like, where is Arabica grown versus Robust? Are there new Arabica producers? Because there are. Or even have, like, India's an interesting one to look at, because they have a really rich data set. And it's changed is how much the ratio of production of Arabica and Robusta over time, how that's changed. And maybe even matching that up with the prices for the two different types of crops to see if that's influencing things.
You've got my mind spinning on some good ideas. Like, if you're at home, so say, I guess, you have a whole bean bag of coffee, you have a bunch of data points, right? You have, a lot of the time, especially in specialty, because that's primarily we're talking about specialty on the show, but we talk about the grand scope of coffee. I'd say on a specialty bag of coffee, it's going to say something like some random name given by the roaster, not random, but chosen, obviously. And then maybe some information about elevation or where it came from. And you could get even like latitude, longitude on those things, and keep a little spreadsheet, right? And then have yourself a little data set where, I don't know, you could someday in the near future, like, put on all your coffee for the year and be like, oh, I mostly bought coffees from Africa, or,
I should... So one of my colleagues, they
used
to do coffee tasting, and they actually kept details about like, they're experimenting with, like, if I use like X many grams versus like this many grams, or how long they let it kind of steep in the water. You can also do stuff with that to see, and then match it up with your tasting notes to see, like, oh, for this particular coffee, if I let it sit for like 1 minute and 33 seconds versus 1 minute and 36 seconds, it improves the flavor profile. You can do. Yeah.
Oh, that's super sciencey.
That's the economist. Yeah.
I love it.
So, yeah.
I could make it easier too. I could build a Google spreadsheet with the columns already in there. And so people could just like go copy it. And it's just like, we could do like a big, just like homebrew data collection and just like see what happens.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of fun. All right. I'll see what I can do.
Data's fun. You can do a lot of stuff with it.
Okay. So data is fun. I'm trying to get people to understand data is fun. So, all right. What are you working on currently, and how can our listeners be a part of that?
I think because we put a lot of the data out there, really like some of the best feedback. So if you go on our website, if you're using our data or reading any of our reports, getting emails asking questions is really helpful, especially in the sense because it's global. Because it helps me, for instance, knowing like where do I need to tighten up our definitions or even provide definitions or better explanations. That's helpful. And we get a lot of requests for data, but we almost never hear back on how it's used. And I really love when people come back and say like, oh, here's the paper, because it helps.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's just three. It's me and two other people on my team, and we deal with a lot of data. So it's nice to get insights from other people, like what they're seeing, the trends and whatnot, and how they're looking at the data. So in that sense, and also the project that you had done, it was really interesting to look at that as well, because there's only so many hours in the week to get stuff done. So being able to see what other people do, it helps bring a better understanding as well for me. On our website and our email address, just stats@ico.org. Very simple.
We'll supply links and things to the ICO, to the work happening over there. So if you're listening, you can click on over and find yourself in a world of coffee data.
The ICO Award for Excellence. It's primarily aimed at PhD students or post-PhD, but it's a competition. So you can write a paper using coffee data on coffee, focused on sustainable development of the coffee sector, and there is a financial reward for the top papers. I guess it's data, handling data, processing data. It's really fun. Like if you're into problem solving, it's just really fun to take a deep dive and to look at a data set, and then it kind of actually ties into the other. Like the best piece of advice I'd been given was learn at least one new thing a day to sleep well at night. So if you're dealing with data, you're definitely going to learn at least one new thing.
A key part of the scientific method is collecting data. Then another key piece is understanding that data through data analysis. I hope this conversation has encouraged you to pick up a YouTube video or a book on analysis and statistics. Catch us in the next episode as we continue our adventure in coffee science. Thanks for tuning in, and as always, and until next time, happy brewing.